right, let's see here. Okay. Hi, everybody. You are at MS Office Hours. It is Thursday, August 19th. I am Heather Cox. With me today are my co-hosts.
What's up, everybody? It's Stephanie.
Hello, Victoria here.
And Garrett.
And we
Nailed
are
it.
excited for part 2 of securing Microsoft 365 with Azure Sentinel. If you missed part 1, it gives you a whole background, and then everybody was so excited we wanted a live demo. Just dig in, see what it's all about. And so our friend Corey Lee is back to give you that demo. So Corey, we'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Glad to be back for a second edition here. I will say this is actually the most lively and fun office hour that I've had a chance to be a part of. So kudos to the leadership team here, driving good vibes and awesome content. We are back for our second edition on securing Microsoft 365 with Azure Sentinel. I actually go through, I'd call it 2 tracks here. One is the how quickly to get up and going with Azure Sentinel being our first track. So I'll walk through that here shortly. And we'll start off from the vantage point of assuming we already have something like an Azure subscription in an environment. And then we'll segue into the life of an individual that maybe is working in a K-12 district or a higher ed institution. And really, you want to start to leverage Azure Sentinel to monitor your M365 environment, gain insights into some of the security events, and ideally get to that point where you're able to have one place to go to be able to triage the security activity within your environment. We've heard from a lot of our customers, man, we just have too many portals to go to. It creates fatigue. We don't know where to go for what. So we're here to tell you today, Sentinel is the answer, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. So hopefully you can see my screen here okay. And right now you just see me in the Azure portal. And I'll actually take a step back just, for anyone that's not familiar with Azure here. And one of the first steps that you will want to take, this is, once again, we already have an Azure subscription, whether there's anything in an environment or not. But as simple as really being able to go and search for Sentinel in the top search bar, and you'll get plopped into this page here, which is essentially a landing page where we can click this create button, which allows us to essentially create a Sentinel instance and an underlying workspace. So I'll walk through it. I won't actually click submit, but I'll just talk you through how quickly this can happen. So one of the first things that we'll do is we'll create a workspace, and you can think of that workspace as being the underlying data lake, if you will, where all of the data will come in for Azure Sentinel. Um, Once we click into that, you really have the ability for anyone familiar with Azure or not. There's this concept of a subscription, which is really a container where you house resources, you control billing and all of that good stuff. And there's a resource group. So you have the ability to use an existing one or create one net new. Here, I'll just select just an existing one that I have, but the ability to create one net new, super easy by clicking this hyperlink there, and then giving it a name. So I'll just make this Sentinel Office Hours. And really what you're doing here is just you're naming your Sentinel instance. Some organizations may have multiple Sentinel instances in the environment. I've seen everything from one Sentinel instance for our AMC within the environment, another for our academic side, or multiple Sentinel instances due to different security teams, not necessarily really wanting to work well with one another. But
Hey,
the
Corey,
reality is, yeah.
Really
Yep.
quick, is it possible for you to zoom in a bit more on the screen so that they can see it a little bit better, because it is kind of small?
Okay.
That is
That
so
big
much better.
enough?
Thank you
Cool.
very much.
All
Thank
right.
you.
No problem. So nothing super spectacular there, but I'll call out one thing here, which is selecting the region for Azure Sentinel. So depending on where your location may be, whether you're US West or US East, et cetera, typically we recommend you set up the instance closest to you. However, I will highlight that Sentinel costs are different by region, partially due to just resources that are used as with respect to the region that it gets deployed in. So I highlight that one item there, and we'll just go ahead and so we'll keep it US. This review and create button. Once that's completed, here we'll see a validation there. So the review is completed, and clicking create pretty much allows us to create that Sentinel instance in the environment. I'll jump into it just to show you how it looks for brand new. But we'll quickly segue to an existing environment that I have where we'll execute the rest of the demo here to kind of highlight and walk through some scenarios with some pre-existing data and what it looks like to investigate a scenario and so forth. So here you got this deployment succeeded button, and I have my workspace that's been created. So with that, I'll go ahead and click the add button here. So one thing with Azure Sentinel, I think I covered this last call, but for any organization that has an existing log analytics workspace, and maybe you're using log analytics already in the environment, whenever Azure Sentinel is deployed on a log analytics workspace, it comes with 90 days of retention by default. So typical workspaces have 30 days. Once you add Sentinels to it, you get 90 days. So that's important for a couple of different reasons. One, for any environment where we're storing things, or we have things like the Office 365 activity logs that's tied to the Security and Compliance Center, or things like our Azure Active Directory logs that only stick around for 30 days. This is where that additional 90 days of retention inside of Azure Sentinel comes very handy. So when you have a brand new Sentinel environment, this landing page that you get dropped on really highlights how to get started. And the first thing that you might do in the environment is connect some data. So we'll click this connect button here, and as I mentioned, I won't necessarily actually go and connect in this instance. We'll talk to another one, but for any environment where you already have Microsoft 365 up and running, you're using Teams, you have SharePoint sites being used, external users being added to your environment, all of that good stuff. Quick way to come in and identify many of the Microsoft connectors specifically is to select on this providers button here, click Microsoft, click OK. And you'll be presented with pretty much all of the Microsoft connectors. I won't necessarily go through all of them in detail, but everything from Azure Active Directory and where you see things like the Azure Active Directory sign-in logs. Actually click into this one and talk about how straightforward and simple it is to get up and going. But I'll highlight before I jump into the connector there, a couple things you want to note with Azure Sentinel. Typically, environments that have existing SIEM solutions, one of the traditional issues with a SIEM has been the difficulty on behalf of getting data into it. In many environments, you're having to deal with, building custom integration connectors, deploying add-ons, creating webhooks, and doing things like developing parsers to normalize data and all of that good stuff. Well, I'm here to say with Azure Sentinel, one of the objectives that we had when we developed it was how to make it super easy to connect data in, and how to get our security teams and our security analysts focused more on analyzing data as opposed to worrying about how to not just manage infrastructure, but also how to get data into the solution. So I'll call out these 3 buckets here that are of specific note. Out of the box capabilities that come with many of these what we call built-in connectors. So any of these connectors that you see in this list of 116 built-in connectors that in many cases come with out-of-the-box solutions. And those out-of-the-box solutions tend to revolve around things like workbooks, queries, and analytics rules. So I'll just jump into the Azure Active Directory connector here and show you what it looks like to go and enable that. But simply clicking into the connector, the ability to go in, we'll talk a little bit about the permissions here, but this top section here kind of talks through what are the permissions to go and get things set up, assuming we have the right permissions in the tenant level. Since we will be touching things like Azure Active Directory, we should be solid. And the ability to, at a minimum, have access to the resource group and the Logix app. The Log Analytics workspace for this first setting. Means we have everything that we need to just go and enable all of the connectors as possible. I'll scroll down here, and one of the first things that you might do is simply select what is the data that you want to bring into Sentinel, specifically for Azure Active Directory. I'll click on, well, actually, I won't click on it here because I don't have permissions in this particular workspace, but I'll talk a little bit about each of these what we call tables or data sources within the actual connector. They all have varying roles, and most organizations don't really understand or know that there are different types of log sources that exist within inside of M365. So Azure Active Directory obviously is one. There's a sign-in log, there's an audit log, there's the logs that come on behalf of identity protection, and a plethora of other log sources. But here you have the opportunity to say, well, if I just want to bring in the sign-in logs because that's all I care about, select this button here. And if my permissions were enabled on this workspace, you see a button that says connect, and you're done. You're off to the races. Assuming you want other data sources to come in over this connector, like the audit logs, or you're tracking things like group membership changes, or we're tracking changes to the directory, role changes, all of that good stuff. That's a great source to bring in. These other sources really relate to, I would say, areas of focus that are starting to grow in importance, more so now that we've seen specific types of cloud-based attacks that not only pivot from on-prem to the cloud, but in some cases pivot from cloud to on-prem. And what we find in many environments, there's not a lot of monitoring happening. So specifically when it comes to things like Azure Active Directory, where we're thinking about the entry point, if you will, to the cloud environment, who's logging in, are they risky users, do they have potential, are there leaked credential scenarios that are happening, and who's really doing what? It really comes down to the identity. So we expose some of these additional data sources on behalf of customer requests, things like non-interactive user sign-in logs, which include things like the conditional access activities, et cetera. Service principal sign-ins, where little unknown area that isn't always tracked and monitored, but this concept of having highly privileged service accounts, if you will, that are cloud native, and they're represented as application objects in Azure Active Directory, but they have the ability to, in some cases, if there's a breach, allow users to be impersonated, things to happen like creating something like a permission consent grant that allows an individual to go and read all of the mailbox data for end users across the environment. So for things like service principal signage started to pick up in regards to like why it's important to think about some of the underlying areas of focus where we may have some nefarious or suspicious activity happening in our tenant. And managed identity sign-ins, won't speak a lot about that, but this concept of baked in managed identities that don't have credentials that are being managed, they're tied to resources that you deployed, and they have the ability to be, deployed and deprovisioned kind of automatically without you really having to manage credentials. And provisioning logs for scenarios where you're provisioning out to applications. Let's say you have, G Suite and Box and other services like Salesforce, et cetera, where you're provisioning those identities from Azure Active Directory into those SaaS applications, the ability to get access to those logs. And then lastly, the ADFS sign-in logs, which I won't really go into a lot of detail about for it, but for environments that do have ADFS, as we've started to recently really increase the amount of focus around ensuring that monitoring the hybrid identity state, or the stack, if you will, all up is an important area of focus. One, because it is kind of that tip of the spear when we start to talk about zero trust, right? When we have an environment that has Active Directory, you got things like Azure, Azure AD Connect, syncing those identities up from on-prem. And sometimes you have admins that are, it's the same admin account being used for on-prem environment for the cloud. And you have these federation servers involved, and it's important to be able to monitor the entire spectrum to include Active Directory, the middle layer, in this case, ADFS or some other federation server, as well as the cloud-based directory. So I'll now hop into just some of the things that are available out of the box for particular connector or given connector. Something we call workbooks, which we'll hop into one and show an example of. Think of this as a built template for insights into that particular data. So things like evaluating the Azure AD sign-in logs, evaluating the audit logs, looking at things like insecure protocols. If you have things like legacy authentication still enabled in your environment, being able to bubble up some of that information in the form of an additional report. We find these to be extremely helpful in the context of being able to better understand not just the activity, but also how to best interact with the data that exists in many of these log sources. In addition to that, just some quick query samples on how to go and harvest some of this information. We'll show an example of KQL here. You can run that query directly from this dashboard and jump straight into what we call log analytics KQL and see the query language there. But I'll highlight one last thing here first before we do that. And this is really where the meat and potatoes come into play regarding how to best get efficient with respect to being able to detect the things in the environment that are happening that are most critical. This concept of analytics templates, which you can think of them really as detection rules. And I'll highlight a few of them in particular. This one at the top, modified domain federation trust settings. This particular rule, and we tend to request that customers start with the high severity rules, and there's a reason for that. But a few of these rules that have been released are backed by scenarios that our Microsoft Security Threat Intelligence team tracks and monitors. So whenever we're investigating a scenario with a customer or nation state activity and so forth, a lot of the things that we uncover and develop roll back into Azure Sentinel. And one of the examples here is this particular analytic rule called modified domain federation trust settings. This relates to a scenario where we may have an attacker that has found their way with access to Azure Active Directory, elevated permissions at that, and have now proceeded to create a cloud-based backdoor. And that backdoor being an additional federation trust that has been added into the directory as a means to create a completely different or isolated channel for authenticating and accessing the directory. This particular scenario, we want to make sure that customers are bringing this to the forefront, that it's not flying under the radar, and that we ensure that we're not just using the capabilities within inside of M365 and Azure AD, but we're also monitoring for activity that is typically high impact or high severity. So this makes it super easy for our customers to go in. These rules are here out of the box. So the ability for you to, and we'll hop into more detail about analytics rules, but the ability for you to come click, deploy to our environment, couple steps, and we'll show an example of that. Before I proceed, just want to make sure there's any questions before we move on to some of the other scenarios here. All righty, I like it. So we'll get going. We'll round out so we covered Azure Active Directory, gave a little primer on that. Some of those additional connectors that are high on the list, I'd say Azure Active Directory Identity Protection. If you have that with your current licenses, that's where a lot of that risky sign-in, risky user behavior telemetry comes in. Azure Activity, the log source where any of the platform or resource level changes that are happening in the environment, awesome log source for that. But we'll skip down here to those connectors that specifically for customers that have A5 or E5 and they're using Microsoft 365 Defender already. The ability to come in and deploy these 6 connectors here in the middle there we talked a little bit about last week into Azure Sentinel for free. And starting really with the Office 365 logs, typically we say we want to ensure that those logs are being covered. So once again, those activity logs across Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, all of that good stuff that comes in the Security Compliance Center can come in, get that enabled. Once again, same process with the Azure Active Directory connector. The Microsoft Defender for Office 365. This particular connector for any customer that has this isn't using it. It's that email hygiene security solution. So as we see potential scenarios where there's spear phishing or we have end users clicking links or attachments that potentially have malicious content in them, this is where a lot of that particular data would come from. Defender for Identity. That capability inside of the Defender suite that focuses on monitoring your on-premises Active Directory environment, really geared towards looking at scenarios like lateral movement in Active Directory, things like DNS reconnaissance, or really looking into scenarios where credential theft activity is taking place in on-prem AD. And then lastly, or at least close to lastly, Defender for Endpoint. That endpoint detection and response capability, really looking at what's happening on my endpoints, my client workstations, or my servers. Do I see things like 0 days? Do I see scenarios where some type of malicious payload has ended up on a device? and a lot of that telemetry. Microsoft Cloud Application Security really focused on that. How do I discover applications that are being used in my environment that maybe are unsanctioned, that are being used by my end user population? Also, how can I see when there's data being transferred to various SaaS applications in my environment, whether it's authorized or unauthorized? And a lot of that rolls up to this centralized connector, Microsoft 365 Defender. I'll jump into this one in particular really quickly here because each one of these connectors, just to highlight, will bring in so Office 365 connector brings in all of those activity logs. These 5 connectors bring in alerts and incidents. But I'll highlight this particular connector as we talk about its ability to not just bring in alerts and incidents, but also to bring in some additional metadata as we start to consolidate these connectors into one all-up connector. So something to call out, just that we've seen in some environments, and it's important to highlight here, just that we are in the process of rolling many of the standalone connectors for M365 Defender into one connector, but we're not there yet. So generally speaking, if you come into this particular connector, assuming I had the permissions updated here, this button will say connect. You click connect, and you're done. Now you have all of the M365 Defender incidents, alerts coming into Azure Sentinel from M365 Defender. No additional activity required. But if you want to take it a step further, and there are scenarios where you want to expand what you're doing inside of Azure Sentinel, you want to use more analytics rules and enrich data regarding entities and other insights. You also maybe want to get more insight into additional logging data that may not necessarily come through in an alert or an incident. The ability for you to come down and connect specific types of events. And I'll talk through a few of these in particular that have started to become more important in education. But we've seen a lot of scenarios around being able to do things like track students that are potentially cheating during tests that are being taken in a web-based format, using things like the device network events data source. This particular data source really allows you to harvest a lot of that rich telemetry and content that shows you websites that are potentially being accessed. It shows you URLs and IPs that users are going to, a lot of the network activity that's happening from your endpoints, where when you think about just some of the traditional scenarios, whether we're a BYOD scenario or a scenario where we have folks using corporately owned devices, super powerful and rich context that can really complement scenarios where you're looking at firewall logs or you're just trying to get a better feel for maybe some malicious activity that's happening and potentially beaking it out to something that's infrastructure owned maybe by an attacker group or something like that. So the ability to come in, get more fine grain where you need to exist within this particular connector. And I will highlight that once again, bringing in these particular areas of focus, they are not free. However, you do have the ability to bring them in a staged way to monitor and evaluate costs. And if I had some data coming in, I'll show you another example. You'd see over here just kind of total volume of events, and the ability to come in and turn things off where you see fit, if it's deemed not valuable or it's impacting, let's just say, budget within the environment regarding scenarios. So I'll jump out of that for a second here, but the reality is, even beyond the Microsoft particular data sources, which great opportunity for you to bring that in, a number of other, let's just say, built-in connectors from our huge partner ecosystem. Feel free to come in and peruse if you have an environment or you spin one up. But everything from common security tools that are often used, like network appliances or endpoint threat intel devices like AI Vectra, CDN solutions like Akamai, and for environments that we know that's also started to pick up a little bit in education, these multi-cloud, cross-cloud, or cloud-agnostic environments where customers are using AWS and Azure in the same environment. Awesome ability to also bring in things like the AWS Cloud Trail logs and get some of that visibility across not just Azure AD and access to Azure, but for environments where Azure AD is integrated with AWS, or where they're separate, the ability to still stitch together some of those activities that maybe happen across admins that are in Azure and AWS and elsewhere. So I'll jump out of that here and I'll dive into the news and guide section. And I'll highlight some things that are fairly new, but super important to what we're seeing today, as school gets ready to kick back up, we're producing a lot of guidance around ransomware. And something that we've released that we'll be going through here today is our fusion detection for ransomware. And you have the ability to come in and learn a little bit more about that. But what this really refers to is this concept of us using a lot of the machine learning and intelligence and the threat information that we've studied over the past 5 or 6 years regarding human operated ransomware, in the form of automating how we detect when there's pre-stages of ransomware activity happening in the environment that are potentially going undetected, and bubble that up to things like the security team or the security analyst. Traditionally, why this was a challenge is because some of the behavior and activity that we'd see in an environment would represent itself in a low-level alert. So something that's a low alert, maybe it doesn't get triage, it doesn't get a lot of focus. But now having the ability to connect the dots between low-level alerts, all of which that follow a pattern that match what we know to potentially resemble something like human-operated ransomware, where we can pull that together, bubble it up as an insight, and then create an investigation package for you to be able to go in and look more into that. So we do recommend that customers pay attention to the what's new. A lot of great stuff coming out there. Now I'll jump into an incident. And this concept of incidents that we talked about last week was this container concept, where we're not just talking about having events and having activities and having alerts get triggered in an environment, but more so. I'll actually jump over to my other Azure Sentinel environment here that we have some data to jump into. But this concept of being able to group alerts, group in activity into incidents where we've already done some pre-correlation on your behalf. And what that really means is now we can put in front of the security teams more actionable alerts, or quote unquote incidents, if you will, that have already been pre-vetted in some way, shape, or form. You can sort this by high and really target many of the major things that you care the most about. I'll do that here, pretty straightforward. And I'll actually focus on one particular incident that we'll highlight. I'll call out a scenario where, since we'll really be looking into ransomware here, sorting by ransomware, where this that fusion scenario that I just described starts to really become real when we think about what's already happening in the M365 environment, what's already maybe happening across our endpoints. And when we see something like this particular incident, where we call a multi-stage incident, now you can come in, look at the description of it, get a feel for what exactly it's looking at in the environment. You'll see a list of potential products that are being used to inform the insights that are being generated by this automated detection. And then do something in the form of an investigation. We see customers using, assigning owners, changing the status, all that good stuff. But I think the real power here are two things. One, being able to use the investigation graph, which we'll jump into here. Secondly, being able to take actions. So in scenarios where there's something that we want to do immediately, something super high risk like this particular scenario where we want to kick off an investigation, one of the super cool integrations between Sentinel and M365 is this concept of creating a war room. And this war room concept being using teams within an environment to create an immediate workspace that can add different individuals from different teams. Maybe we have a pretty broad environment where we got folks from the email hygiene team, folks from the endpoint team, folks from the SOC team, and so forth. And we need to pull them together quickly to be able to investigate a scenario that's high risk. This actions button down here, which is somewhat new over the last year or so, allows you to go and create a team on the fly. And this team containerizes the incident information, it drops it in there, and then it creates this workspace where you can actually go and now collaborate on the incident across teams. Pretty cool capability that exists there. In addition to that, automation rules and investigation, which we'll kind of highlight here today, but that war room conversation, super cool. Many organizations generally may buy a separate product to do something like that. But for environments that already have teams, that integration just makes it a very seamless process to use that as that type of solution. So I'll click into investigate here. And what you'll see is something that probably doesn't on the surface make a lot of sense. It's something we call the investigation graph. This investigation graph allows us to dive into what's happening in the context of an incident. So here we have an incident with multiple alerts, lots of stuff going on. We really need to be able to make sense of it. Many of these diagrams or these buttons here actually relate to, and I'll zoom in a bit, they relate to entities in the environment and alerts. So you see we have Jeff here, who's the user in question that we're potentially is involved in these scenarios. We have some suspicious processes. We don't know where to start. This is where we may jump into something like the timeline view. The timeline view to be able to see, okay, like how do we now get a feel for what really happened? We see 30 alerts that have come together. We see potential ransomware involved. This now allows us to jump into the early stages of the timeline. So we see something like a suspected skeleton key attack. And we know that the host that this particular ties to. So this now gives us a point of reference to say, okay, this is where the potential activity started. This is where we may want to start our investigation. And we know the endpoint that we're focusing, as you see this highlighted button that really targets where this particular activity originated. As you see here, Azure Advanced Threat Protection, aka Defender for Identity, is what generated this particular alert, and it's showing us something that we may want to actually jump into. But as you see down this chain, additional activities that have started to take place. This led to a network request to Tor and an anonymizer. Now we see something like Mimikatz being deployed on the environment, which we can pretty much assume what maybe now is happening. At which point we see something like the first instance of a ransomware payload being witnessed on a device. This particular scenario, at this point, I'd imagine, and in most environments, this screams high risk. We have to do something ASAP. This doesn't mean necessarily that the environment has been fully encrypted already, but it would mean that we have insight that lets us know we have a ransomware encounter and we want to go and take some action. So what does it look like to take action? This is where we jump into a bit more scenarios around what does it mean to use things like automation from Azure Sentinel. Before I get there, though, I'll just show, just for the sake of the demo, for any of these types of alerts, we do display things like a description, an alert name, and additional information that we produce. So you have the ability to dive into more of that. We also expose things like the entities. So if you want to get a quick snapshot of, okay, who are the users involved? What are the hosts involved? IPs. I want to go out and do some additional investigation. You have that ability there. And we won't go into insights, but this concept of, okay, now we know that there's something that we maybe need to take action on. Where do we go from there? I'll actually minimize my screen a little bit here. But this concept inside of Azure Sentinel, as it is not just a SIEM solution that maybe is evaluated and reviewed in most environments, but it is also what we call a SOAR solution. So this top button, I'm not sure why it's not popping out here. Did I lose it? Let's see. Actually, I'll go into view details. Had a little blip there. Yeah, we'll hop back into the incident, but we'll show just the primary incident view outside of the incident timeline graph, and the opportunity to take a look at, for any of the alerts or scenarios that exist within inside of the incident, go and run something like an automated action. Now we're walking through kind of a manual triage flow here, but the ability for you to expose this, have this hyperlink show to view Playbooks, and I'll talk about one example here for a second, but we'll actually go and find that Mimikatz scenario or that alert that was triggered here, this one. So we see something like Mimikatz. It's ended up on an endpoint. Defender for endpoint told us that information, and this is where we likely want to say that's a no-no. We don't actually want that to persist. We want to make sure that device is we can get that device under control. The ability to come in and leverage the view playbooks feature to do things that allow you to go and immediately take action. Specifically, if this is a device scenario, we'll talk about some of the device actions, but something like going out and executing a Defender for endpoint investigation package, going and grabbing the artifacts from that device, going and essentially where possible, also quarantining that device, isolating it, maybe preventing it from accessing stuff temporarily, collecting this investigation package, and then doing some deeper insights. Something well within your power as an automation flow within the environment. Also, if for whatever reason we say, well, we really want to look into the IP address that was being used from that particular endpoint. Let's go and see if it's truly malicious, or was this someone just installing something on the device that they really shouldn't, that they didn't know what they were installing for whatever reason. We can go out and do something like check virus total, get the reputation of the IP address that's coming from, that the activity was coming from, and then gain more information. The ability to use these automations as part of the context of the alerts, super powerful. Once again, won't go into a lot of detail here, but we'll walk through an example. Everything from being able to block IPs out at the edge firewalls, submit ServiceNow or things like ITSM tickets, all within your means regarding being able to respond to some of the incidents that you might see with inside of Azure Sentinel. So I'll jump out here and completely out of incidents and walk through a couple things that probably are more little known capabilities. One being entity behavior. And hopefully the demo gods, respect me on this demo here. But this is the user and entity behavioral analytics feature inside of Azure Sentinel. And the power of this feature is really focused on looking at anomalous and atypical behavior across the environment. So this could be a host that's showing some type of atypical behavior, or an IP, or a user. So we'll just go and highlight Jeff here. He's had 266 alerts in the past 30 days, 24 hours or so, and this doesn't seem normal. The ability to come in and get a bird's eye view around what has Jeff been up to, what types of alerts have been triggered, on behalf of Jeff as a user where he's an entity, what types of resources is Jeff accessing, and do we see any other insight regarding what's abnormal for Jeff? Are there scenarios where we've seen him access a new resource, like a server that he's never accessed before? Are there scenarios where Jeff maybe has now accessed a mailbox that, generally speaking, he doesn't access? These are the types of things that would be bubbled up here in the form of insights. So as you might see, things like mass download by Jeff. Historically, he doesn't seem to actually download, terabytes or gigabytes of data for whatever reason. But now we're seeing that type of scenario. This becomes a use case that's super important, especially for environments that have OneDrive or that have data sources that exist in the cloud, is because typically in these advanced ransomware, human-operated ransomware attacks, we tend to see the same pattern. We tend to see something to the tune of some point of initial entry that results in an endpoint device or a server that starts showing some abnormal behavior. Things like the antivirus being disabled, or things like the cloud delivered protection being turned off. And generally speaking, that then turns to some form of lateral movement in the environment and additional payloads being launched. So all of these kind of breadcrumbs that start to pop up within an environment oftentimes don't get triggered by alerts, unfortunately, in most environments, partially because sometimes it's behavioral based and it's not really signature based, or it's not based on really some type of alert definition. It's based on an entity that's doing something that may, in normal circumstances, technically be legitimate, but for the most part, it's not in this case because of the way in which they're doing it. So the ability to get an insight into that here and quickly get into a scenario, well, we know, or we should know, when we see something like a suspicious inbox forwarding rule, we know that tends to lead to some form of exfiltration in the environment, ultimately resulting in scenarios where the attacker wants to try to not just create what we call a primary ransom, but a secondary ransom, holding the data hostage for the institution or the organization as a means to not just get the ransom or increase the likelihood that the ransom payment is made, but also to potentially sell that information and then have other attacker groups circle back to that organization, for potential a secondary attack. So super important and critical to be able to look for some of these things, and ideally to be able to ensure that activity or action, if you will, can be ensued. So that's the Yuba functionality that I'll highlight. Hunting, won't spend a lot of time here, but the capability that really allows institutions to be able to proactively threat hunt within the environment. So think of things like Hafnium, where maybe there's an environment where we have down level versions of Exchange or a hybrid Exchange environment, and we need to be able to go out and see what is our exposure to Hafnium. or to some of the attack kill chains or stages that took place post some of these scenarios. The ability to come in, select many of these default queries that we have for threat hunting. So these are produced by, once again, our threat intel team, where you don't have to necessarily have on-staff threat hunters. You can actually go out and do some of that threat hunting right out of the box with native capabilities straight in Azure Sentinel. And assuming you have that data inside of Sentinel, the ability to go out and produce insight regarding what's currently an exposure point for the environment. Notebooks, won't spend a lot of time there, but for environments that handle things like SOC workflows and orchestration across teams, super awesome tool to be able to outline those workflows and those processes and then be able to use them in the context of investigations. Threat intelligence, the ability to bring in, whether it be your own threat intel feed, some examples, Anomaly and Risk IQ, et cetera, or to take advantage of the Microsoft threat intelligence feeds. Comes baked into Azure Sentinel. We do a lot of investigations around things like nation state activity, botnet activity, and pump a lot of that insight into Azure Sentinel from the trillions of signals that we get from a lot of that activity, all for your usage. So another scenario can be super highly impactful, but once again, you have the ability to update that and add to it where you see fit. I covered analytics rules at a high level. I'll talk about a couple scenarios here as we approach the end of this session, but the ability to use these rule templates and add them to your environment. The power for these rule templates that I'll highlight, twofold. One, a quick way for you to be able to see, well, what is Microsoft saying is some of the high impact things that we should be looking for based on our Azure AD logs or based on our Defender for Endpoint logs. You have the ability to come in, sort by high, look at the data sources and say, all right, we want to look at the Defender logs and specifically the things that we need to pull in that are high severity from a Defender perspective. Let's go ahead and pull those in first because Microsoft says it's high. Or you can go through and change the severity and update your rules. But we do tend to provide this to customers as a reference because many customers really want to know, well, what types of data should I bring in, and why? So this is a great way to start with that. And we do kind of, once again, show here's a data source that matters. Another thing that we do that's pretty cool is we align to MITRE. So for anyone that tracks that, the ability to look at the techniques and the tactics that are generally used by attackers as a means to say, we want to improve on initial entry scenarios, or we want to improve on scenarios where there's an attacker who's establishing some type of persistence in our environment, trying to stay around for the long haul. The ability to map or sort by tactic and then use that as a benchmark to say, here's an area where we want to target. I'll highlight one last thing here, which is all throughout Azure Sentinel, we expose the KQL queries that exist underneath the hood that's being used for detections, that's being used for the rules and for the workbooks. So in each one of these, you can come in, use it as a learning tool, get a feel for what are we looking for, what's relevant, how do we use the data within inside of Azure Sentinel, and how do I get better at looking for the things that I care about, or just simply using some of the default out of the box rules that Microsoft provides to look for the things that are most critical. With that watch list, won't spend a lot of time there, but the ability for organizations to bring in things like we want to track all of our admins, or we want to track all of the IP addresses that we know in the environment are considered to be bad IPs. The ability to do some of those things customly, but also the ability to use some of our templates. Some of those exist like high value assets, as I mentioned, admins, resources, identity correlation, the ability to use those watch lists to really kind of help with some of the automated detections and the rules that you might configure in the environment. I'll end here with two areas that are, once again, fairly straightforward. We covered automations briefly, but this concept of two really real types of automation within inside of Azure Sentinel. Automation rules, which are really used for, I would say, day-to-day operational activities, assigning incidents to a particular individual, closing out incidents, changing severity, things of that nature. Playbooks really more focused on things like, how do I orchestrate a set of actions that are going to do something specific? And maybe that means as part of something that I see, I want to go out and spin up a ServiceNow request. As part of that, I also want to go and send an email to the security team. And maybe as a couple other actions, I want to go and block a user sign in and ultimately create something like a war room so that we can go and we can, kumbaya and talk about it. So it's more for those complex orchestrated scenarios where you might use things like playbooks. Solutions here really focused on areas where if you have certain security technologies within the environment already, and you're looking to kind of get up and going with a scenario where you want to get those proof point logs into Azure Sentinel, but you also want to automatically go and deploy the insights and the rules and the things that come along for the ride with that data source, the ability for you to come in and use solutions as a way to go and auto deploy a lot of that content that's built in out of the box into the environment and start leveraging it. I'll end here with community, and I'll bring it up because there's a lot of rich information that exists in the community. We like to say that, in education, we really want to ensure that our customers are reusing existing IP. And what that means is leveraging the Sentinel community as a means to go and take advantage of things that have already been built by your peers and other folks out in the industry, to include things like dashboards and custom connectors and detections and functions and logos. I'll jump into playbooks here just as an example, but there's a lot of contributions specifically to playbooks. There's a huge interest around automating actions and really doing more with less, specifically for security teams in education, where we know there's security teams are generally light on staff. Maybe there's not always the case where there's multiple senior level resources that exist. So as we start to see more increased scenarios where automation really becoming a very active and important component of the security teams in education, we definitely feel that the playbooks area is a great area to start if you're looking to really take advantage of the community. So I'll stop there. I know we have about 2 minutes left. No, I didn't exactly leave a lot of time here for questions, but I will open it up now for questions based on what we have on the docket.
Heather's muted. All right, Greg, go ahead. You're up. You got your hand raised. Go for it.
That's what I was going to say.
All right. So two things, because we are currently deployed Sentinel in our environment. And one thing that you might articulate perhaps briefly is the relationship between log analytics, monitor, and then Sentinel, and understanding that relationship and those layers.
Okay.
And then the other thing is perhaps for benefit of people who already have sort of converged Defender, right, under the new security console, and then the benefit of then layering Sentinel on top of that, along with like Intune and those pieces. So that was something that was good for me to wrap my head around in the beginning. So for others, it might help.
Sure thing. So I'll hit on the first piece, and then I'll dovetail into the other two. And while I'll do that, I'll even bring this up just since you mentioned it. If it can actually show up here for me. So the first is specifically log analytics, Sentinel, Azure Monitor. So think of Azure Monitor really as an umbrella set of solutions that revolve around base templates around insights, connectors and things that can allow for data sources and functions and parsers and all that good stuff to be used. Inside of that umbrella of Azure Monitor is a capability called Log Analytics. So think of that as specifically a data source or data store, if you will, where data comes into the Log Analytics itself. It is that underlying data lake. So you can think of Log Analytics as such. When it comes to Azure Sentinel, it is essentially a brain, an engine. It connects all of the dots across these various capabilities that in other cases would be separate components of just Azure, but it connects the analytics engines, the intelligence feeds, the quote unquote logic apps, wrappers, and that data lake, and to include log analytics, all together in one nice bow. As far as the integration between Defender for M365 and Azure Sentinel, the huge benefit there is for customers that have already deployed M365 Defender. They're likely getting incidents and alerts and all that good stuff into M365 Defender. Actually, try to bring up an example here. There is bi-directional integration between Sentinel and M365 Defender, where the alerts and the incidents actually go both ways. So the ability for you to be able to close out alerts and incidents, investigate them in Sentinel, and have them be closed out from an investigation and then remediated inside of the M365 dashboard is a huge benefit as part of that particular integration. A second benefit is the fact that because there is very tight and native integration between those two capabilities, you have this concept of XDR plus SIEM that starts to come together. So what that means is whether it's telemetry that's coming from Sentinel, that's enriching things that M365 Defender is seeing, or telemetry that's coming from M365 Defender that can enrich things that Sentinel is seeing, you have the ability for those additional data sets to, let's just say, improve the overall visibility and insight into activity that's happening within the environment. So hopefully that answers that question effectively. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, we are at time. So what I will do is I'll go ahead and stop the recording.